For today's session, we're going to look at what's commonly known as Viking knitting. There's very little evidence, historical evidence, for this to say that this is how it was made, but finds similar to the kind of jewellery you can make with it are quite common. Whether this was how it was done is pure speculation. But if I hold this up a little closer, you can see that it has a weave effect, and it's woven into a tube. The tubes are then split and beads are put in just to make... I've tried to keep this fairly in keeping with Viking tradition of the colour and the type of beads. These are modern. These are not specifically for reenactment purposes. They are purely for the fact that they look pretty, but it's the style that is similar. And what we do to produce that is we use wire. Now, wire comes in lots of colours and lots of thicknesses. We have silver wire, and that is a 0.6 millimetre, and for this one we have a copper, and that is a 0.5 millimetre. I think you can see the difference between the two. Obviously, thickness of the wire depends on how thick this becomes. It also makes a big difference to how hard it is to manipulate. For example, we have this piece, that piece. All of these are different purely from the fact that they are different grades of wire, and they've been pulled through I use a knitting gauge, preferably a metal one because it does get a little bit tight, and I decide how big I want the coil to be. Then when it comes off, it's put through the gauge I want it to be, and then you brutally pull it through until it stretches it that deep. Okay, so if I wanted it to go smaller, I would put it through a smaller one that was tighter. As you can see, that doesn't come through easily, but then I would usually use some pliers, and then I would pull it through, and suddenly that becomes that gauge instead of that one. It really is as simple as that. To make it finer, you pull it through a finer gauge. But if you have very heavy, dense wire like this one, and this is much denser wire because you can see the thickness there compared to the 0.6 there, so you can see that is much, that's probably a 0.8, 0.9. Now obviously that is going to be a lot harder to pull through these gauges. So you would start, and you'd start at the biggest one, and you would force it through that gauge. Okay, I'm not going to do it now because I need pliers for that one because it's very heavy. That's how you'd make it finer. The same as the one, this quite fine one here. It isn't necessarily the wire that's thinner there, it's been pulled through a much finer gauge. It's been pulled through probably that one to make it small enough. Now, how do we get it to this point? Terribly technical. We have some wire and we have a wooden spoon. And despite the fact that there are things you can buy that have all the right bits and pieces, the wooden spoon is still the best. It is still the most practical, it still works the best. So on the wooden spoon you put what I call the little wire daisy, and I stick it down with sticky tape just to hold it in place. Then you begin to thread the wire through, and I've deliberately let it almost get to the end here because you have to be incredibly careful. You have to use fairly short pieces of wire, because as you're manipulating it, it's very easy for it to hit you in the eye, or if anyone is sitting close to you, if you're demonstrating in person, it's very difficult if you have a long piece of wire and it's flailing off to the side. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to bring this up here. So what you do is you, on each turn, you just coil it through the one above. This one's got a little pushed out of shape because it's been in the drawer. And then you do the same to that one. You coil it through, and you coil it through the next one. And that is pretty much how you keep going. You keep going until it's a long piece. Now you'd add a piece on now. So you'd take a piece of the right gauge and you'd thread it through and you'd add a piece on, and then you'd make it as long as you need it to be. When you take it off, you have, in effect, a sausage like that. You just pull the top off and you loop the wire through so that it doesn't uncoil. And at that point you decide what gauge you want it to be. You pull it through the gauge, and I must admit, I don't cut it. I make the pieces to the size I want. So I work out before how big I want the pieces to be. Because cutting it is always a bit dangerous in that it can uncoil and I find it messy. So I measure how big I want these to be, and I stop it. When this pulls through, it contracts and then it elongates as it pulls through, depending on the gauge that you're using. So some of it is always guesswork. You can be very scientific about it, but some of it is always guesswork. But I try to keep them fairly even, and then I just use wire to make the hooks, and these are just some bead caps, and a little bit of chain with some links. The same with a larger one here, again in the same kind of look. It's just this is a little finer, because you can do this double on here. If you're starting this as a beginner, I wouldn't suggest you start with double. I'd suggest you start with a single one and get used to doing that first. But you can do double gauge, which is that one. And this one I decided to do a little bit finer, so it's a little bit thinner. It's single gauge, it's smaller gauge wire, and it's just a little bit thin. It's got a little bent out of shape because I've been storing them. But as you can see, the gauge of the wire is thinner and it's a little more delicate and a little lighter to wear. And of course you can, if you like, once you're used to doing it, get a bit creative. And again, this is not historically accurate. At no point am I saying that this is going to be historically accurate. This is where we're getting into crafting. So at this point it's pure crafting, and it's just some wire, some very shiny beads, and that's just for being pretty. That is nothing to do with reenactment or historical accuracy. It's just about fun. Now, as crafts go, this one is a little more complicated. It does take a little bit longer to learn. This bit is actually the easy bit. The tough bit is getting used to starting these, getting it in line and keeping it in line. As I say, this one's been in the drawer, so it's been moved around a little bit and I need to get it back into shape. But that bit is the complicated bit, not this bit. Once you've cracked that, you're okay. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this. If you'd like to know anything else, let me know. This is Viking Knitting.